I'm really delighted to be here. This is the first time that I've ever spoken to a group that is concerned about environmental crime in the way that you are as a global and an economic issue. I'm not a wildlife specialist, but I came across this problem when I was writing Dirty Entanglements and was finding that nature and natural resources were becoming an increasingly important funding resource for crime and terrorism. There's nothing functional about killing a rhino. There's no logical use for any keratin out of the rhino horn. It's the ultimate dysfunctional criminality. And it is also one of the most successful examples of illicit entrepreneurship in the world. I've looked at many forms of illicit activity, and almost nothing has grown as rapidly as the train and rhino horn. Remember, 2008, there were 12 rhinos poached in South Africa. Now we're talking in this region, not just South Africa, but neighboring states, of over 1,200 a year. And what we're finding is that, or I'm finding, is that the rhino horn, and people were agreeing at CSIR, is not functioning like a normal natural resource commodity, but by a luxury commodity. Because South African and African exports to China are diminishing as the Chinese economy is contracting, but there's no diminution in the killing of rhino horn. So that's something that is being bought and purchased by an elite, in which what we're seeing in a concentration of wealth in the world, in which these enormously wealthy elites have enormous capacity to buy. And this is not functioning as something that one is buying for production. And the reason that the rhino trade has grown so rapidly, it is that it is built on existing cross-national networks that trade in other licit and licit commodities. So it's not as if we're looking at something that just developed sui generis. It couldn't. Nothing can scale that fast without networks being in place, routes being in place, and individuals able to move that activity. And I think it's also important to think about how the money moves connected to the rhino trade. One of the things that seems important is that it moves in cash, and it moves through something called trade-based money laundering. One of the things that we need to think about is the problem of pseudo hunts. So there is a legitimate ability to hunt rhino in South Africa by paying fees. But as Julian Rademeyer has pointed out, some of the people who came along to allegedly hunt the rhino were trafficked women. So you had a convergence of fraudulent documents for the rhino hunt, fraudulent declarations that individuals were actually engaging in the hunt, as well as a convergence with human trafficking. Once the South African government moved to cut off this pseudo hunts from Southeast Asia, this was not the end of the problem. So where was the next locale for the pseudo hunts? One of the major conduits of this rhino horn from South Africa is into Vietnam. To have these linkages, you need a Vietnamese community, and there are Vietnamese functioning in South Africa, but there's a large Vietnamese community in the Czech Republic. Many of them are highly integrated into Czech society. It's the third largest community in the Czech Republic. They're Czechs, they're Ukrainians, and they're Vietnamese. They are cigarette smugglers, and it is a major, major activity of huge proportions. And as I'm saying, this illicit cigarette trade becomes the venture capital for even more illicit activity. In fact, how did the Czech authorities discover that there were rhino horn now transiting from South Africa through the Czech Republic? One of their informants in the illicit cigarette trade informed them that there was some wildlife shipment coming through the Czech Republic. We've identified in our research 3 types of networks that are very involved in the illicit rhino horn trade out of South Africa. Part of them are linked to the Chinese diaspora community, part of them to Laos with close ties to Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the third is a Mozambique-based narcotics syndicate that also smuggles guns, ivory, rhino horn, and has links to other narcotic and wildlife traffickers in Tanzania, Zanzibar, and Kenya. And some of the people who are involved in this consolidation function are connected to Pakistani networks, and some of those are rather known Pakistani networks that have links to crime terror groups in their countries. If you look at this crime and how it converges with other criminality, you often get more traction than if you're looking at it as a lone issue. For example, you're never going to get the Chinese to targeting illicit wildlife trade. But if you point out to the Chinese that the same traffickers are involved in the drug trade, they will name that and be very critical and ready to act on this. And if you point out to them that these organizations have moved up into an even more high-value commodity than drugs, like rhino and ivory, and therefore they are stronger and more able to undermine you through their involvement in wildlife trade, they become much more interested in illicit wildlife trade. Not because of the commodity itself, but its potential to enrich and empower the networks that threaten them. So you have to link it to problems that become part of the national security agenda of a particular country. So what we need to think about is why this crime is scaling, what are the elements that have this, and where is this going to go next, and how do we try and stem this trade before we have driven this wildlife to extinction. And we're dealing with problems of what I would call, as I said to you, a dysfunctional selection that will have enormous consequences for the sustainability of the planet. And we need to be thinking more broadly and tying this issue not just to an illicit trade in wildlife, but what are we doing as human beings to undermine our sustainability, and to explain things in much clearer language than just saying we're losing the rhino, but what is this doing to our entire ecosystems and our sustainability of life. So, thank you.